Stop scrolling. A quiet policy change just rewrote a 70-year strategic habit. In a press exchange, the question sounded technical. Why does so much Canadian defense spending leave the country? The answer revealed something far bigger. Mark Carney acknowledged the long partnership with the United States, then calmly admitted it had become a dependency. And dependencies in geopolitics eventually become pressure points. For years, tensions, tariffs, and political rhetoric had shaped the relationship, often associated with the era of Donald Trump. But this announcement wasn't about reacting to personalities. It was about removing leverage entirely. Here's the pivot, and it sounds simple enough to miss how disruptive it is. Build, partner, then buy. First, manufacture defense systems domestically. Second, cooperate with trusted allies. Only after those two options fail, purchase abroad. That order quietly restructures power, because procurement is not just budgeting. It determines who controls supply chains during crises, who sets timelines, and who can say no. Under this framework, Canada begins expanding sovereign capabilities across aerospace, artificial intelligence, naval systems, cyber defense, and Arctic security. Tax revenue circulates internally before leaving the country. Decision-making shifts from external approval to domestic planning. And the message is subtle but unmistakable. Partnership continues, dependence ends. This is not isolation. It is negotiating from strength. The difference between needing cooperation and choosing it. To support the shift, the scale is historic. Hundreds of billions allocated to procurement and infrastructure. Defense spending projected to double within the decade. Domestic sourcing moving from roughly 1/3 to about 70%. Those numbers are more than funding. They redesign incentives for industry, research, and long-term security planning, including commitments aligned with NATO responsibilities. The transformation isn't loud, dramatic, or confrontational. It doesn't cancel alliances or redraw borders. It simply removes the possibility that any single external decision could halt national security operations. And that's the real shift. Not a break between neighbors, not a political rivalry, a structural change from reliance to resilience. Because in modern geopolitics, sovereignty isn't declared in speeches. It's built into supply chains long before a crisis ever begins. A trillion-dollar shift, announced in calm, bureaucratic language. Over the next decade, Canada plans to invest $180 billion directly into defense procurement and $290 billion into security infrastructure, with more than $125 billion in ripple economic impact. On paper, it sounds like budgeting. In reality, it redraws leverage. Here's why. Influence in alliances rarely comes from speeches. It comes from supply chains. For decades, when Canada purchased most of its defense system from the United States, Washington automatically held structural influence, not by threat, but by position. The supplier always has the final timeline, and timelines shape decisions. But now the framework changes. Instead of a single primary source, Canada expands partnerships toward Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and the United Kingdom while growing domestic production. The result isn't confrontation. It's optionality. During a press conference, Mark Carney was asked whether Canadian industry could compete with the American defense industrial complex, a system strengthened by policies associated with Donald Trump and his America First transfer approach. The response was careful and revealing. Canada will still buy the best equipment available, but purchasing alone is no longer enough. Future contracts must include participation in development, integration into supply chains, and domestic capability growth. That single adjustment changes incentives for every supplier. Instead of a customer, Canada becomes a co-producer, and the numbers confirm it. Domestic procurement projected to rise from under 1/3 to roughly 70% within a decade. Not symbolic, structural. Why does that matter? Because dependence creates vulnerability quietly. Radar components, aerospace parts, maintenance software, none dramatic individually, yet together they determine operational independence. So the strategy expands. Agreements with allies across multiple continents, including integration opportunities linked to European Union supply chains. The goal isn't to replace partners, it's to prevent a single point of failure. That distinction is the entire policy. Historically, Economic pressure worked because security reliance existed beside trade reliance. Remove one pillar, and negotiations change tone automatically. This is why the shift is described as evolutionary rather than confrontational. No alliances canceled. No rivals declared. Only a gradual transition from buyer to participant to builder. And that carries a long-term consequence. When security capability no longer depends on a single external decision, it cannot easily become a bargaining chip, regardless of leadership cycles or political climates. Trade diversification was the first adjustment. Defense diversification becomes the stabilizer, which makes this moment larger than a procurement plan. It's a country redesigning how influence flows around it, not by stepping away from allies, but by ensuring cooperation is always a choice. Because sovereignty in the modern world isn't about standing alone. It's about never being forced to